To hold a belief is one thing, to be endangered because of it is another. Across the world, individuals are not merely punished for their actions, but for the thoughts they express, the allegiances they are perceived to hold, or the silence they refuse to break. When such beliefs become a matter of life and death, asylum emerges as a lifeline, an acknowledgement that political opinion can be more than an abstract ideal. It can be a risk, a burden, and for many, a sentence. US asylum law, shaped by international principles, extends protection to those who face persecution on 5 recognized grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. Of these, political opinion is perhaps the most elusive and contested. Unlike racial or religious identity, which are often visibly apparent, political opinion is not always declared outright. It can be inferred, imputed, or even assumed based on circumstances beyond an individual's control. A journalist covering government abuses may be labeled a dissident. A student protesting for reform might be marked as an enemy of the state. Even those who strive for neutrality may find that, in the eyes of their persecutors, there is no such thing as silence, only implicit opposition. But what transforms a political opinion into a source of persecution? How does a belief, or the perception of one, become a threat in the eyes of a regime, a militant group, or a vengeful community? And how does the asylum process untangle these interwoven elements to determine who qualifies for protection? This exploration frames political opinion through a triadic structure: opinion, threat, and likelihood of persecution, to unravel the complex ways in which belief, danger, and law intersect. In the chapters ahead, we will trace how an opinion, expressed or imputed, interacts with the persecutor's perception of risk, and how both factors contribute to the likelihood of harm. In doing so, we confront deeper questions about power, identity, and survival. When does an idea become too dangerous to hold? Who decides whether an individual is a political actor? And in a world where persecution often stems not from what we say, but from what others believe about us, how do we define the right to refuge? Political opinion in asylum claims is not merely a statement of belief, it is a relational construct shaped by expression, perception, and context. Whether an individual explicitly declares their stance, has one imputed to them, or is caught within a political climate where even neutrality is dangerous, their risk arises from how that opinion is interpreted by those in power. The asylum process must assess not only whether an applicant holds a particular belief, but how that belief, real or assumed, functions within the sociopolitical environment that governs their persecution. Because a persecutor acts based on their own understanding of the individual's stance, the interplay between expressed opinion, imputed opinion, and contextual interpretation is what ultimately determines the credibility of the claim. In some cases, an individual's political opinion is overt. They might have organized protests, joined an opposition political party, or publicly criticized government policies. They may publish articles challenging corruption, speak out in interviews, or even distribute pamphlets supporting dissident movements. Such clear outward action makes it relatively straightforward to demonstrate the presence of a political opinion because the expression can be documented, for instance, photographs at rallies, social media posts, or membership records. Not everyone who faces persecution for political beliefs is a vocal activist. Sometimes, governments or non-state groups attribute a political stance to individuals even when they do not hold it. A journalist covering both sides of a conflict may be labeled an enemy by government forces. A family member of a known dissident could be assumed to share that dissident's beliefs. Imputed opinion can be equally dangerous because persecutors act on their assumptions, and the legal framework treats such assumptions as if the applicant actually held those beliefs. Political dissent is highly context-dependent. In an authoritarian regime, expressing mildly critical views on social media might be viewed as tantamount to treason. In more tolerant societies, the same comment might spark healthy debate rather than persecution. Thus, evaluating the scope and seriousness of a political opinion requires placing it within the specific country's historical, cultural, and political setting. Expressed opinion, imputed opinion, and contextual interpretation do not stand in isolation. They function as a web of interrelated factors that define how an applicant's political identity is perceived and how their risk is assessed. A clearly expressed opinion strengthens an asylum claim, but in many cases, the danger does not stem from explicit political statements alone. It is the way those statements are received and interpreted within the applicant's environment that determines risk. Context dictates which opinions are incendiary and which are tolerated, meaning that an opinion that is benign in one place could be life-threatening in another. This fluidity is what makes imputed opinions so dangerous. Even if an individual does not see themselves as politically engaged, the persecutor's interpretation is what ultimately drives the threat. A journalist who strives for neutrality may not consider themselves part of the opposition, but if an authoritarian regime treats balanced reporting as an attack on state authority, neutrality itself becomes a political act. Each of these elements influences how the others are assessed. If an individual has previously expressed dissent but later claims asylum based on an imputed opinion, the existence of past activism reinforces the plausibility of that imputation. Conversely, even someone who has never explicitly voiced dissent may have their opinion inferred from affiliations, profession, or social ties. The surrounding context magnifies or suppresses these dangers. Where political repression is extreme, the threshold for perceived dissent is dramatically lower. In such cases, adjudicators must recognize that silence or even neutrality can be as incriminating as active opposition. By considering these interrelationships, a case can be evaluated holistically, ensuring that risk is understood not as an isolated event, but as a function of how belief, perception, and environment interact. The existence of a political opinion alone does not establish an asylum claim. What matters is whether it generates a credible threat from an entity with both the capacity and the intent to inflict harm. Threat perception is not simply a reaction to political activity, but a function of how the persecutor evaluates the risk posed by the individual. This means that visibility is not just about public activism. It is about whether the persecutor believes the individual's opinion, affiliations, or perceived influence endanger their authority. The severity of the threat is shaped by the power dynamics at play, as government repression, non-state persecution, and visibility interact to form a landscape in which even a minor association or private dissent can be treated as a destabilizing force. Understanding this triadic relationship is key to demonstrating that the applicant is not merely at risk in theory, but is actively targeted as a perceived opponent. In many asylum claims, the government itself is the persecutor. Security forces, law enforcement, or even judicial systems can be used to silence and punish dissent. People may face trumped-up criminal charges, forced disappearances, intimidation, or even extrajudicial executions. A government's legal apparatus often becomes a tool of oppression, criminalizing expressions of dissent as subversion, terrorism, or threats to national security. Sometimes, persecution flows from non-governmental actors, paramilitary groups, extremist organizations, or even powerful local factions. If the state is unable or unwilling to protect its citizens from these private actors, their threats can have the same life-and-death implications as official government crackdowns. Courts and immigration authorities will look at whether the government's failure to intervene, due to corruption, complicity, or lack of resources, effectively leaves the individual without adequate protection. Not all political opinions attract equal scrutiny. A high-profile journalist or protest leader is likely at greater risk than a casual attendee of a rally. However, visibility can be illusory. An individual quietly harboring dissent may be outed by neighbors, social media, or any evidence that reaches persecutors. In an environment of suspicion, even minimal political activity might be perceived as a major threat, particularly if the regime or group is highly intolerant of dissent. A persecutor's perception of threat arises not just from the fact that an opinion exists, but from how visible and disruptive they believe that opinion to be. Governments and non-state actors do not react uniformly to all political dissent. The level of risk escalates based on how much influence they believe an individual wields. This means that visibility is not simply about public demonstrations or journalism. It is about whether the persecutor thinks an individual's stance, real or imagined, poses a danger to their control. A high-profile activist who openly criticizes a regime may face immediate danger, but a lesser-known dissident can be just as vulnerable if they are perceived as an instigator within their community. The key factor is not only the applicant's actual prominence, but how their persecutors interpret their significance. Threat also operates as a feedback loop with political opinion. A government that routinely labels critics as subversives or terrorists effectively broadens the category of people who are considered threats. This means that an individual who might not have been in danger a year ago could find themselves targeted as repression intensifies. Non-state actors similarly exploit this dynamic. If a militant group declares that anyone working with a particular organization is an enemy, then even minor associations become life-threatening. When adjudicating asylum claims, understanding this interplay is crucial. Threat is not just about past harm, but about how evolving political climates change the way opinions, affiliations, and even silence are interpreted. A well-founded fear of persecution does not rest on any single element. It emerges from the cumulative weight of past experiences, future risk, and the nexus that connects them to political opinion. The strength of an asylum claim depends on demonstrating that these factors reinforce one another. Past persecution serves as the strongest predictor of future harm, but only if it can be shown that the danger stemmed from political opinion. Likewise, even in the absence of prior harm, an individual can establish a credible likelihood of persecution if conditions in their home country demonstrate that those in their position face systematic targeting. A successful asylum claim is not built on isolated pieces of evidence, but on a coherent narrative where past events and projected risks converge, making clear that returning to the home country would result in persecution on account of political opinion. Perhaps the strongest evidence of a well-founded fear is a history of suffering linked to political opinion. If a person has already been arrested, beaten, or threatened for their dissent, U.S. asylum law generally presumes a continuing risk. This presumption can be rebutted only if conditions in the home country improve significantly, or if there's a convincing reason to believe the persecutors no longer pose a threat. Not everyone has experienced direct harm before fleeing. In these cases, asylum officers or immigration judges rely on country condition reports, credible media sources, and expert testimony to determine if someone who returns to their country would face imminent danger. Factors such as widespread government crackdowns, known patterns of violence against opposition parties, or specific threats made against the individual weigh heavily in this assessment. Critical to asylum law is proving that the harm is on account of the individual's political opinion, be it genuine or imputed. Violence or hardship alone is insufficient unless it is tied to that person's political stance. A person fleeing generalized crime may not qualify for asylum without demonstrating that the perpetrators targeted them for what they believe or represent. Likelihood of persecution does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from the convergence of past persecution, future risk assessment, and the critical nexus that ties these factors to the individual's political stance. A strong asylum claim rests on demonstrating that these elements reinforce one another, creating a cohesive picture of danger. Past persecution is the most compelling evidence of future risk, but its weight depends on how directly it was linked to political opinion. If an applicant was imprisoned for their activism, that history serves as a presumption of continued danger unless conditions have significantly changed. However, even in cases where past harm is not present, country conditions and documented patterns of persecution can establish that returning would place the individual at imminent risk. Nexus is what binds these elements into a credible claim. Without a clear connection between the feared harm and political opinion, an asylum case weakens. Generalized violence or instability is not enough. If an individual was attacked, but there is no evidence that their beliefs or affiliations were the reason, then past persecution alone does not necessarily establish a likelihood of future harm. On the other hand, if an applicant belongs to a group that has been systematically targeted, the risk assessment shifts. Future persecution becomes a reasonable expectation not because of direct threats alone, but because persecution is demonstrably tied to the political category into which the applicant falls. The interdependence of these elements means that asylum adjudicators must assess them as a system. Past events frame future risks, and both must be anchored in a clear rationale for why the applicant was and continues to be a target. Asylum adjudication is not a linear process in which an applicant merely checks off elements of a claim. Rather, it is a cyclical and interdependent evaluation where political opinion, threat perception, and likelihood of persecution continuously shape and reinforce one another. No single factor stands in isolation. Each informs the others, creating a feedback loop that either strengthens or weakens the case. Expressed or imputed opinions become meaningful only in relation to the persecutor's interpretation. Threat is credible only when tied to an actionable likelihood of harm, and the likelihood of persecution is persuasive only when past events and future risks coalesce into a clear trajectory of danger. Understanding this cycle is critical because an applicant's risk is not a fixed state, but a function of how these elements interact over time. An opinion that once carried little risk may become dangerous as political conditions deteriorate. Similarly, an individual who was not previously targeted may become a focus of persecution if their perceived influence grows, or if new actors assume power. These shifts illustrate why adjudicators must not evaluate claims as static snapshots, but as evolving narratives in which the applicant's political identity, the persecutor's threat perception, and the conditions shaping likelihood of persecution all move in concert. This interdependence also underscores why gaps in one area of evidence do not necessarily invalidate a claim, but should instead be assessed in light of the reinforcing relationships between the triads. An applicant who lacks direct proof of past persecution, for instance, may still demonstrate a high risk of future harm if country conditions show a clear pattern of targeting individuals in their position. Likewise, someone who has suffered prior harm does not need to prove that the same persecutor remains an active threat if the broader environment of repression remains intact. The task of asylum adjudication is to recognize these interwoven dynamics, ensuring that protection is not contingent on a rigid formula, but on a holistic understanding of how political opinion, threat, and likelihood of persecution interact in the real world. In essence, the triadic approach of opinion, threat, and likelihood of persecution reveals the intricate underpinnings of political opinion-based asylum claims. It reminds us that a mere expression of dissent, whether actual or imputed, must be evaluated alongside the intensity of the persecutor's response and the credibility of the resulting danger. To make this analysis more practical and impactful, asylum seekers, lawyers, and adjudicators alike can benefit from a few key considerations. Applicants should thoroughly record not just overt political activities, for example, protests, publications, or membership in opposition groups, but also any evidence that third parties have imputed opinions to them. Gathering witness statements, social media records, and detailed country condition reports helps establish that the perceived stance is genuine and significant within its local context. A claim of government persecution carries added weight if corroborated with news reports, human rights organization findings, or expert testimony demonstrating a pattern of repressive behavior. In situations involving non-state actors, showing that the government is unable or unwilling to protect its citizens underscores the seriousness of the threat. The strongest cases weave together evidence showing that political opinion, or an imputed version of it, is indeed the driving force behind the threat. This nexus can be bolstered by highlighting any past persecution directly tied to an individual's beliefs, membership, or perceived allegiances. Where direct evidence of previous harm is lacking, carefully compiled reports on ongoing persecution of similarly situated individuals can support a credible fear. Even in the absence of past harm, a robust demonstration of what might happen upon return, through country background evidence, expert assessments, or targeted threats, can establish the likelihood of future persecution. Maintaining a clear line between ordinary criminality or generalized violence and politically motivated harm is crucial, as asylum protection hinges on this distinction. Legal counsel can employ the triadic model to pinpoint weaknesses in a case, for instance by identifying gaps in how the applicant's opinion is documented or clarifying the persecutor's motivations. Bringing in cultural or regional experts, psychologists, if the applicant has experienced trauma, and fellow activists can strengthen the broader narrative, showing that each element in the triad logically connects to the others. By recognizing the deep interdependence among opinion, threat, and likelihood of persecution, asylum systems become better equipped to protect those whose political stances expose them to genuine danger. Ultimately, this triadic analysis encourages a more holistic, context-sensitive approach, one that moves beyond box-checking toward a thorough and empathetic understanding of each individual's circumstances. When policymakers, judges, and advocates work in tandem, they can preserve the spirit of U.S. asylum law, ensuring that those in genuine fear of persecution based on political opinion find the refuge they need.